Hey guys, what's going on? So, I'm going to quickly cover how to conduct the beginner crash course workshop. I'm actually shooting this video just after I ran it at the Encode hackathon. Thought it went pretty well. The recording is available. You can see right here. The link is going to be this little YouTube icon here in the README. So, basically, the README itself has all the stuff that I covered in the workshop, right? And it's pretty extensive. I wrote it all out so that if somebody was just reading this repository, they could just kind of get all the lessons from it without having to like watch the video or anything. They could also watch the video and I go over the same thing. Inside the conducting markdown file, that's where I have some details here about how to conduct this workshop. So I've got some step-by-step stuff, but overall this one is kind of straightforward when you look at the presentation slides. So if I pop those open, you can see here that they walk through exactly what's in the README. So I start with obviously the title, and then I have these QR codes here for the links. So this source code one's going to take you to this beginner workshop right here. It's going to take you right here where you're going to see the README and you're going to see the code and stuff. As you go through the slides, what I did was I basically stepped through. I talked about the key pairs. I talked about Solana wallets. And then I started to talk about the fact that you can register keys or the public key with the system program. And then I started to talk a little bit about native smart contracts or native programs on Solana. And then I started getting into the account model. And this is kind of where some of the questions start to boil up, right? Like people really want to understand how the account model works. So I talk about some of the inner data, things like that. And then I move into transacting with the network, talking about RPC, talking about transactions. And I spent a lot of time on the transaction format and the instruction format because you literally see these payload structures in the code, both in the JavaScript code and in the Rust code. And then somewhere around this section with the transacting stuff is when I started to show the code. So I started with all the JavaScript stuff and I did that through VS Code. So, you can just open up the scripts. You can talk about all the different functions that are in here and just try to explain slowly what's going on here. I isolated creating a transaction into its own util function because it helps to kind of see those steps that are in the slides right there, right? So I talked about the block hash and etc. You can kind of see the components of that slide right here. So it kind of goes the same way throughout the rest of the scripts. A couple things to note with the JavaScript scripts is the DevNet connection sometimes a little spotty. Like DevNet can have issues, like etc. So I did make sure that my local validator setup was going, and I was able to use that. So a note on that is I mentioned to these folks at the Encode workshop today that they should at least have Node.js and Solana installed. These scripts are requiring you to have a local key pair for Solana. Maybe that's something we can iterate on in the future, but for now, I just asked that people do have that installed so that they could run these scripts locally. But I also ran them myself in the terminal here and just showed the output. When you do that, I print out a lot of these keys. So it's a really good thing to do, to go and grab these keys and look at them on the Explorer. So like you can obviously hook into LocalNet if you want, and if you're not running DevNet, or you can do DevNet and you can look up some of these addresses that come out or the signatures that come out. So it's pretty good to do that. A lot of people didn't really know what a blockchain explorer was, especially since this is a beginner workshop. You can't really assume. So it's great to go over that stuff. And yeah, just whatever you think would be good. After I went through, you can see I've really just followed these slides. So then I started to get into programs because what happened is I started to get some questions about how smart contracts know what to do, like how you tell it what to do, how do you give it inputs, how does it like know what functions to run. So like just saying that the instruction data is bytes wasn't really enough for people to really grok what was going on. So I felt that it was good to get into writing a program after that. So then you can start showing like, here is the hello world example where we're basically going to lay down, here's those inputs, they match the instruction payload format. And then here's a couple other like key configs. And then I get into the Hello World Again program, where you can see the same program basically with the addition of multiple instructions, right? So we have the match statement, we introduce borscht, and we introduce these args and the enum for the instructions, right? And then you just go over all that. And that starts to really click with people on how these programs are written and how they can process multiple different kinds of inputs. And then, of course, when you go to the corresponding test with this particular, program here, you can see that I've packaged the instructions into these functions. And if you go to the instruction, file here, you can see that I've got each class right here, and I demonstrate the serialization of this stuff into bytes. And then, of course, returning it as an instruction. And so this is a cool thing. It gives people eyes on creating a raw instruction, on doing serialization, and on setting up like the args. And basically, I really stressed on the fact that this is mimicking what you have written in Rust in JavaScript. And you're using borscht in both cases to convert to and from bytecode. So pretty cool stuff. And then once I covered the program stuff and I went over serialization and instructions and stuff like that, I moved over to tokens, because the cusp of this workshop is obviously the basics and then the on-chain stuff, and that really, links together nicely. And then tokens are something that people want to at least understand at a preliminary level when they're going into something like a hackathon or they're getting started, because like it's the hot thing with blockchain, right? Like tokens, NFTs, metadata. So then I went back and I flipped into the token script, where we're just doing like creating two different kinds of tokens. So we're creating an SPL token, we're creating an NFT. And I had this set up where you just pass in the decimal as an argument or a parameter. And I've just got these assets hosted on GitHub. And then I'm just pointing to some images I found on Google. So pretty straightforward. It shows them a quick and dirty way to test NFT metadata or token metadata. And I'm just using the metadata library from Metaplex to do the instruction here. And I'm just omitting anything that's a little bit more complex than a beginner walkthrough. The one thing that I didn't cover extensively in this workshop, because I didn't want to overload anybody, and I think it's good not to necessarily go into too much detail about it, is PDAs. So you can see that I'm using a PDA, function here. I'm using find program address to get the metadata address. There may be a function in Metaplex's library to do this. I looked a little bit, but didn't see one. But I thought it was good to introduce this towards the end to basically talk about how you can deterministically look up addresses, and without going into too much detail about like seeds and PDAs, I basically just refer to this as like a hash function, and then these are all the inputs that you hash with the program address. And that seemed to make sense to people. And then, kind of mention that you can learn more about program derived addresses if you want to look into it, blah, blah, blah. But for the most part, I think for a beginner crash course, this covers all of the fundamentals. I think the PDA stuff is better suited for a deep dive into programs workshop, which is going to be another workshop. But that's the gist of it, guys. I also covered quite a bit of SolPG as well. I basically went through and imported both programs from GitHub. You can still see the Hello World Again program right here. And I showed them how to connect to Playground, how to connect to localhost, how to build and deploy and get their program credentials. And then, just talked a little bit about some of the features here. I think it's possible that we could expand on how to use SolPG for both your program and your client-side code, just in case they don't have Solana installed. But that's not something that I covered in this particular run-through. So any areas for improvement are encouraged, guys, but this is the gist of how I did it. And like I said, everything really just kind of follows through with these slides and with this README. Like I literally just had this README up on my screen to the right, and I was just kind of scrolling through, and I was going between the slides and the README to just cover all of these different topics. And make sure you share them the links, make sure that they know that this source is available and that they can go through the README and click these links and get more information, such as cookbook and stuff like that. But honestly, I think you guys are good to go. And if you need to, you can also catch my recording of this workshop again, like I mentioned at the beginning, right here in this play button here. All right, later.